Time flies, right? Well, buckle up because these historical facts are about to mess with your entire sense of time. 1. Cleopatra lived closer to the moon landing than the construction of the Great Pyramid. Yep, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, lived around 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid of Giza was built, and only about 2,000 years before humans first walked on the moon in 1969. Mind-blowing, right? 2. Oxford University is older than the Aztec Empire. Oxford University has been around since at least 1096. Meanwhile, the Aztec Empire as we know it didn't begin until around 1428. So while Oxford students were studying philosophy, the Aztec Empire hadn't even started yet. 3. Woolly mammoths were still around when the pyramids were built. Most people think of woolly mammoths as creatures from the distant past, but small populations of these giant, furry animals still existed on an island off Siberia while the Great Pyramid was being constructed. 4. Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. were born in the same year. Although we often think of Anne Frank as someone from a distant historical era, she and Martin Luther King Jr. were both born in 1929. Two iconic figures from vastly different moments in history were actually born just months apart. 5. The fax machine was invented the same year as the Oregon Trail. Believe it or not, the fax machine was patented in 1843, the same year the first major wagon train set off on the Oregon Trail. So while settlers were making the dangerous journey across the US, the first form of faxing was already in play. 6. France was still executing people by guillotine when the first Star Wars movie came out. The last execution by guillotine in France took place in 1977, the same year Star Wars: A New Hope hit theaters. It's hard to believe such an ancient form of execution overlapped with a major sci-fi blockbuster. 7. Nintendo was founded when Jack the Ripper was on the loose. That's right! Nintendo, the company we all associate with Mario and video games, was founded in 1889 as a playing card company. This was the same year Jack the Ripper was terrorizing London. So, while people were fearing for their lives, Nintendo was shuffling cards. 8. The first train journey and the death of Napoleon happened in the same decade. In 1825, the first public steam railway took passengers in England. And just a few years earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy who tried to conquer Europe, had just died. 1821. Imagine Napoleon seeing a train. He'd probably think it was some sort of sorcery. 9. You could take the London Underground while the American Civil War was still happening. London opened its first underground railway in 1863. Meanwhile, in the US, the Civil War didn't end until 1865. So, while Americans were fighting in battlefields, Londoners were riding underground like, what war? 10. The Eiffel Tower and Nintendo's first console were built in the same year. In 1889, not only was Nintendo starting out, but Paris was also finishing its little construction project called the Eiffel Tower. Can you imagine the French unveiling their iron masterpiece while Nintendo was in Japan like, one day we'll have Mario? 11. Harvard was founded before calculus was invented. Harvard University was established in 1636, but calculus didn't become a thing until Sir Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz came up with it in the late 1600s. So if you ever thought calculus was ancient, just know Harvard students were math-free for a good while. 12. People were already exploring the Arctic when the fax machine became wireless. Wireless fax technology was available as early as 1924. Meanwhile, explorers like Roald Amundsen were still trying to figure out how to reach the North Pole. Just imagine sending a wireless fax from the Arctic. Hey, it's freezing here, send coffee. 13. Charlie Chaplin and Adolf Hitler were born in the same year and had the same mustache. Charlie Chaplin, the legendary silent film comedian, and Adolf Hitler were both born in 1889. While Chaplin was making people laugh, Hitler, well, not so much. Fun fact, Chaplin even mocked Hitler's iconic mustache in his film The Great Dictator. 14. The last known widow of a Civil War veteran died in 2020. Yes, you read that right. A woman who married a Civil War soldier in the 1930s. He was much older, she was 17, lived until 2020. Talk about living history. Imagine her stories at dinner parties. Back in my husband's day, there were no cell phones, just muskets. 15. Star Wars and Apple were born in the same year. In 1977, two cultural revolutions began. Star Wars hit the big screen, and Apple was founded by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Little did they know that one would change tech and the other would make nerds everywhere say, "May the Force be with you." Time. It's weird, right? These historical twists show that the past isn't as far away as we think. Which fact made your brain do a double take?